The night was deep and endless when he opened his eyes, not because something had stirred him from sleep, but because something inside him was already awake. There was no noise, no dream to cling to, just stillness, a stillness that felt both familiar and foreign, as if something he had buried long ago was beginning to rise again, slowly without force, like the moon climbing above the horizon. He lay there for a moment, eyes fixed on the ceiling, wondering why a silence so vast could make his heart race. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was the feeling of being summoned, called inward by something that had no name, no face, only a presence. And when it calls, you don't ignore it. He sat up, swung his legs over the edge of the bed, and planted his feet on the wooden floor. Cold, grounding, real. The kind of real that couldn't be faked. The kind that reminded you, you're here, still breathing. He didn't reach for his phone, didn't look at the time. Something told him none of that mattered anymore. Not in this moment. Not in the moment that had decided to meet him with such silence. The house was dark but not unfamiliar. He moved through the hallway like he was walking through memory. Every creak of the floorboard was a whisper from the past, gentle, patient, asking nothing. And then he stepped outside, into the open air. The sky above was endless, not black, not blue, just deep. The stars didn't sparkle with promise, they pulsed with presence, and the wind didn't blow, it breathed. For the first time in years, he noticed that the world was alive. Not as a concept, but as an experience. And he realized that somewhere along the way, he had stopped living. Not physically, but deeply. There had been a time when he felt everything, when a song could make him cry, when a breeze could bring back childhood, when love didn't have to be earned, it was just given. He had been that boy once, wide-eyed, unarmored, curious. But the world had its way. Expectations layered over his chest like bricks, responsibilities stacked against his shoulders. And slowly, the boy vanished. Not all at once, piece by piece, until all that remained was a man surviving a life that used to belong to someone else. He didn't remember the exact day he lost himself. It wasn't one event. It was hundreds, thousands. The way people looked at him when he failed, the way they clapped when he succeeded, the way success became a leash instead of freedom, the way love turned into negotiation. He learned to perform, to adapt, to be who others needed him to be, and in doing so, he forgot how to be who he was. But something changed that night. Something shifted, and it wasn't grand or cinematic. It was quiet, the way truth often is. It didn't scream, it didn't beg. It waited, and now he was finally listening. He started walking, not to go anywhere, but to feel his feet against the earth, to hear the gravel crunch beneath his steps. Each movement became an act of remembering. The wind against his face reminded him he still had skin. The rhythm of his breath reminded him he still had time, not to fix everything, not to become someone else, but to come home. Home to a self that had waited patiently through all the noise. He walked until the sky began to soften at the edges, a pale light creeping slowly into the night's deep blue. The kind of light that doesn't chase darkness away, but invites it to rest. He stopped at the edge of a small lake. The surface was still, like glass, reflecting the slow birth of dawn. And in that reflection, he saw himself. Not the version polished for others, not the version buried under years of shoulds, but the version that just was, tired, awake, real. He sat by the water, knees drawn to his chest, arms wrapped around them. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of echoes. The voice of his mother calling him in for dinner as a child. The sound of laughter from a time when he didn't worry about how he looked. The hum of a guitar string from nights when music was enough. These memories didn't come to haunt him. They came to remind him that he had lived once, fully, unfiltered, and for the first time and longer than he could remember, he didn't try to analyze those memories. He didn't try to understand them or categorize them. He just let them wash over him like waves returning to shore. And in that surrender, something cracked open. He cried, not the quiet kind, not the single tear rolling down a stoic cheek, but the kind of crying that reaches into the lungs and pulls out everything hidden, the kind that has no words, only release. He cried for the years he had lost to pretending. He cried for the moments he let fear dictate his choices. He cried for the version of himself that had begged to be heard but was silenced by shame. And when the crying was done, he felt no weakness. He felt no guilt. He felt clean, like the inside of his chest had been scrubbed with the salt of honesty. He looked at the water again, and it reflected something new. Not a face distorted by confusion, but one softened by truth. And he whispered, not to Dana. There was something about the stillness at night that stirred the most honest thoughts. In those quiet hours, when the world had slowed enough for truth to be heard, he often found himself sitting by the window, watching shadows play across the buildings outside. There were no expectations then, no roles to perform, no distractions left to chase, just the raw, uninterrupted presence of his own being. It was during one of these nights that a thought visited him, not loud, not urgent, just quietly persistent. What if you allowed yourself to be ordinary? He didn't quite know where it came from, but it landed in his chest like a stone in a still pond. Rippling, stirring. He had spent so much of his life chasing the extraordinary. Bigger goals, higher success, sharper edges of self-definition. But the pursuit had never made him feel more alive. It had made him tired. And now the idea of being ordinary, truly, deeply ordinary, felt revolutionary. To be ordinary didn't mean to be invisible. It meant to be authentic. It meant to release the burden of having to stand out, to impress, to exceed. It meant to find wonder in the small, the simple, the overlooked. The sound of a match striking, the warmth of socks fresh from the dryer, the way someone says your name when they're really glad to see you. He had missed so many of those moments while chasing things that looked good on the outside but left him hollow within. He started noticing how much joy lived in the unnoticed. The way sunlight crept through the blinds in the early morning and wrapped itself around the corners of his kitchen. The way his heartbeat slowed when he lay down at night, a rhythm his body had been keeping all his life without thanks. The way his hands moved when he chopped vegetables, how they knew what to do even when his mind wandered. He didn't need applause for any of it. He just needed to witness it. One afternoon, he took a long walk outside the city into the edge of the countryside. There was a path that led through tall grass and wildflowers, the kind of place people rarely visited except by accident. He walked it slowly, his hands in his pockets, his breath deep and unhurried. Along the way, he came across a small wooden bench nestled under an old tree. The bark was cracked with age, and its limbs twisted toward the sky as if in prayer. He sat and closed his eyes, listening to the wind moving through the leaves. It sounded like breathing, like the earth itself exhaling. In that moment, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Awe. Not the kind of awe that stuns you with grandeur, but the quiet kind. The kind that makes you feel small in the best possible way. Like you are part of something much older, much wiser, much more complete than your own story. He didn't need to define it, didn't need to write it down or capture it. He just sat with it, let it move through him, let it remind him that he didn't have to create meaning all the time. Sometimes he just had to receive it. When he finally stood to leave, he placed his hand on the trunk of the tree and whispered, "Thank you." He didn't know who he was thanking exactly, the tree, the sky, the moment itself. But gratitude, he was learning, didn't always need a direction. It just needed sincerity. Back in the city, life resumed its usual pace. But he no longer moved to its rhythm. He moved to his own. When people asked him how he was, he didn't answer automatically. He paused, felt into the question, then answered with honesty. Today I feel soft, or I'm a little tired, but at peace. Or sometimes it's simply, I don't know, but I'm listening. And that honesty, however small, began to shift his relationships. People started opening up more, speaking slower, asking deeper questions. Not because he told them to, but because presence invites presence. He began spending more time with his mother. She had always loved quietly, through meals, through laundry, through worried texts that asked if he was eating enough, sleeping enough, staying safe. He used to brush them off. Now he saw the love behind them. He started cooking with her, asking about her childhood, listening to stories he'd heard before, but never really absorbed. And in that listening, a new bond formed. Not one of obligation, but of shared humanity. He saw her not just as his mother, but as a woman who had lived, struggled, hoped, and continued to give even when no one noticed. There was a moment while chopping vegetables side by side when she looked at him and said, "You're different, you're here." And he smiled, not needing to explain. Because yes, he was here, fully, finally. He started writing again. Not for anyone else, not for an audience, just for the page, for himself. The words didn't always make sense. Some days it was a single sentence. Other days it was pages of feelings. Different. And he smiled when he read those words. Because yes, he was different. Not in some grand dramatic way, but in the way a tree is different after a storm. A little scarred perhaps, but rooted deeper, quieter, stronger. He met with one of his closest friends a few days later. They sat across from each other at a small table by the window, the same cafe they used to meet at when everything felt rushed. His friend spoke quickly, like always, trying to catch him up on everything that had happened in his absence. Work, relationships, the usual tides of life. And he listened, not just with his ears, but with his whole being, not interrupting, not offering advice, just listening. And when it was his turn to speak, he didn't try to summarize. He just said, "I needed to remember who I was when the world wasn't looking." His friend paused, unsure of what to say, then nodded slowly, as if something unspoken had landed between them. Not complete understanding, but recognition. And that was enough. He started waking up before sunrise again, not because he had to, but because he wanted to greet the day with stillness. The first hour of light became sacred. He would sit by the window, cup of tea in hand, watching the sky change like a canvas being painted in slow motion. Some mornings he would write. Some mornings he would just breathe. But every morning he chose to begin gently, without rush, without demand. He began meditating regularly, but not in the rigid way he once tried to force upon himself. This was softer, more forgiving. Some days his thoughts wandered like wild animals, and he let them. Other days there was a stillness so deep it brought tears, and through it all, he learned to stop fighting the mind, to stop judging the noise. He simply observed, like watching clouds drift across the sky. None of them wrong, all of them passing. At night, he would walk the city streets as they dimmed, lights flickering in windows, strangers brushing past with their own invisible burdens. And he felt something new toward them. Not distance, but tenderness. He used to see strangers and feel nothing. Now he saw stories. The man waiting at the corner might be grieving. The woman with tired eyes at the bus stop might be carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. The teenager with headphones might be hiding from a world that never listened. And in seeing them, he softened. He had once wanted to change the world. Now he just wanted to meet it with presence. He began visiting a small bookstore tucked between two buildings, the kind of place that smells like old paper and time. He would spend hours there, reading poetry, philosophy, even old children's books. Anything that reminded him of simplicity, of truth, of beauty that didn't ask to be loud. He wasn't looking for answers. He was looking for resonance, for words that echoed what his heart had begun to remember. One afternoon, as he sat on the floor of the bookstore, a small boy wandered past him, dragging a balloon. The boy stopped, looked at him, and smiled. A real smile, the kind that children give freely, without agenda. And in that moment, he felt a rush of something pure. Joy, connection, grace. He smiled back, and the boy continued on, disappearing into the shelves. But the feeling stayed. It reminded him that presence is contagious. You don't have to teach it. You simply have to live it. That night, he lay in bed with the window open. The city breathed in and out, and so did he. He placed a hand on his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heart, and whispered a simple truth. I'm still here. Not the version of him that performed, not the version that constantly sought validation, but the version that watched the stars as a child and wondered. The version that once cried when his mother sang lullabies. The version that laughed without needing permission. That version was alive again, not healed completely, but whole enough to begin again. And so he did. It was strange how the simplest things had become the most profound. Washing dishes had turned into a meditation. Watching steam rise from a cup of tea felt like witnessing a ceremony. Even walking to the corner store became an act of presence. He had spent so much of his life searching for meaning in big achievements, in milestones, in applause. But now he was finding it in the ordinary. And it wasn't that the world had changed. It was that he had slowed down enough to finally see it. He often sat by the park bench near his building, the one that faced a tree that bloomed white flowers in spring. When he first moved to this neighborhood, he had passed that bench 1,000 times, never once stopping. He was too busy, too caught up in where he needed to be. But now he sat there nearly every afternoon, not waiting for anything, not filling time, just being, watching the world pass, children laughing as they ran across the grass, dogs tugging at leashes with eager joy, elderly couples walking hand in hand, their silence more powerful than words. He didn't feel apart from it anymore. He felt a part of it, the breath of life moving through all things, including him. One afternoon as he sat there, a woman approached the bench with hesitant eyes. She was older, maybe in her 70s, with soft features and eyes that looked like they'd seen more than they let on. She asked if she could sit, and he nodded. They didn't speak for several minutes. Just sat, two strangers sharing a pause in the world. Eventually she said, "My husband used to sit here. Every morning before he passed." He turned to her, unsure of what to say, but before he could respond, she continued, "He told me once that this bench helped him remember he was still alive, even when the doctors said otherwise." He didn't offer comfort. He didn't say sorry. He just nodded and looked at the tree in front of them. Its branches moved gently in the wind. The white blossoms swayed like tiny lanterns, and together in the shared quiet, they honored someone neither of them could see but both could feel. After she left, he sat there longer than usual. Something in her words stayed with him, that the bench helped her husband remember he was still alive. He had never thought about life in that way before, that sometimes being alive isn't about doing more. Sometimes it's about remembering that you are, that you still are, even when everything tries to convince you otherwise. He walked home slowly, each step deliberate. The sun was beginning to lower, casting gold across the sidewalk. He watched his shadow stretch beside him, and for the first time, he smiled at it. That outline of himself, silent, present, proof that he still had light inside him. He began keeping a small notebook in his pocket, not to document accomplishments, but to collect moments of presence. One day he wrote, "The smell of rain on pavement." Another day, "The way her eyes softened when I didn't try to fix her sadness." Another, "How the tea tasted sweeter when I wasn't distracted." It wasn't a diary, it was a practice, a way to anchor himself in a life he had once sleepwalked through. He noticed that people around him began to respond differently, not dramatically, but subtly. The barista smiled longer when handing him his drink. The neighbor who never used to say hello now waved when passing by. Even his co-workers seemed calmer when they sat near him during meetings. It wasn't that he had become special, it was that he had become real. And realness, it turns out, is something people recognize, even if they don't understand it. He didn't try to teach anyone. He didn't speak of his journey unless asked. But presence has its own language. It doesn't need translation, it's felt. And people feel safe around those who have met their own darkness and chosen not to run from it. There was one evening that stood out more than most. He had been invited to a dinner, a small gathering of acquaintances, people he used to see as part of the background of his life, familiar but distant. The room was filled with chatter, laughter, the clinking of glasses, and for a moment he felt like the old version of himself, the one who would scan the room, find his role, step into it. But this time he didn't. He just observed. He listened, not just to the words, but to what wasn't being said. At one point, someone asked him, "You've been quiet. What have you been up to?" And instead of explaining his retreat, instead of summarizing his awakening, he simply said, "I've been learning how to breathe again." The room fell into a gentle silence. Someone smiled, another nodded. And then the conversation moved on. But for him, that moment stayed, because in that one sentence, he had told the truth. Later that night, walking home beneath the stars, he whispered to himself, "I'm breathing again." And it wasn't just a statement, it was a declaration, a promise, that no matter what came next, no matter the challenges, the distractions, the inevitable forgetting, he would return, again and again, to the breath, to now, to himself. He began lighting a candle each morning before he spoke to anyone, a single flame in a quiet room. Not as a ritual of religion, but as a way to remember that life was fragile, that presence was sacred, that the day ahead was not a burden, but a gift. Some mornings he sat with the candle for only a few minutes, others for nearly an hour, but every time it grounded him. It reminded him that he didn't have to rush into the world. He could enter it with peace. One rainy afternoon, he visited a friend who had recently gone through a loss. They sat together in her living room, the sound of rain tapping gently against the window. She spoke of her grief in fragments, half-formed thoughts, words that trembled as they left her mouth. And he didn't try to make it better. He didn't offer solutions. He just listened. And when she finally stopped speaking, she looked at him and said, "Thank you for not trying to fix it." He smiled softly. Some things aren't meant to be fixed. They're meant to be felt. That was the moment he understood what his stillness had given him. Not just peace for himself, but the capacity to hold space for others, to be a presence that didn't require performance, to be the silence in someone else's storm. And slowly, gently, he began to understand. This was his path now, not to escape the world, not to reject it, but to meet it moment by moment, with presence, with grace, with love that expected nothing. He wasn't trying to become enlightened. There came a morning when he woke up with a strange sensation, not one of urgency or clarity, but of weightlessness. Not as though everything had been resolved, but as though the need to resolve everything had dissolved. He lay in bed a little longer than usual, watching the way light crept across the ceiling. There were no plans pressing on his chest, no mental checklist waiting to be ticked. The only thing he felt was space, an internal spaciousness that welcomed the day like an old friend. He got up slowly, barefoot on the wooden floor, and went to make tea. The water took its time to boil, and he didn't rush it. He stood there, watching the steam rise from the spout, the way bubbles surfaced then disappeared. The simplicity of it felt sacred. Everything now felt that way. Sacred not in a ceremonial sense, but in a real, everyday way. The kind of sacred that exists in showing up fully for what used to be invisible. While he sipped his tea, he looked at the small altar he had created on his windowsill. It wasn't elaborate, just a candle, a stone he'd found by the river, and a folded piece of paper with the words, "Come back." A reminder to return to this moment, this breath, this self. He lit the candle and sat in silence, letting the quiet greet him without needing to do anything about it. No agenda, no seeking, just allowing. That day he wrote a letter to himself, not from guilt or longing, but from compassion. He wrote to the version of himself who had endured without asking for much, who had carried the weight, who had shown up even when he felt broken. The letter didn't try to fix anything. It simply said, "Thank you for surviving. Thank you for staying." And as he folded the letter and placed it inside a drawer, he realized he had never spoken to himself with such love before. In the days that followed, he began reaching out to people he hadn't spoken to in a long time. Not to rekindle anything, not to explain, just to offer presence. He called an old friend from school and listened to her talk about her garden. He sent a message to a former colleague just to say he hoped they were well. No expectations, no waiting for replies, just gentle offerings of connection. One afternoon, he walked into a small art gallery he'd passed 100 times, but never entered. Inside, the walls were lined with paintings that didn't scream for attention. They whispered. One canvas in particular stopped him, a swirl of blue and gray, soft brushed strokes that looked like movement caught mid-breath. There was no description, no artist's statement, just the painting, asking to be seen. He stood in front of it for a long time, and then, without thinking, he whispered, "I know this feeling." It wasn't about interpreting the art. It was about being mirrored by it. The way the colors didn't fight each other, how the imperfections added depth, how it didn't try to be anything more than what it was. He left the gallery in silence, carrying that feeling with him. Later that night, he journaled, "We're all just unfinished paintings, layers of color, streaks of doubt, glimmers of light, and none of it needs to be erased. It just needs to be seen." He started spending more time in nature again, not on long hikes or dramatic excursions, but in quiet places. Parks, patches of grass behind buildings, benches beneath trees. He would sit and observe the way squirrels darted from branch to branch, the way leaves flickered like small flames in the breeze, the way clouds changed shape without needing permission. And in these moments, he felt connected, not to some grand idea of the universe, but to the intimacy of life itself. He stopped looking for signs, stopped asking for answers. He started trusting the silence, trusting that not every question needed to be solved, that sometimes the not knowing was the most honest place to be. And in that not knowing, he discovered peace, not the kind that stays forever, but the kind that arrives when you're no longer trying to hold it hostage. He began volunteering at a local shelter, not because he wanted to save anyone, but because he wanted to show up in the world as someone who cared. He served food, folded blankets, sat with people who didn't need advice, just presence. There was one man who came in often, always quiet, always alone. One evening, after serving him a meal, that one sentence stayed with him for days, because that, he realized, was what presence really was. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about helping someone feel seen without needing to be fixed. He carried that awareness into every interaction after, whether it was the cashier at the store, the stranger on the bus, or the colleague who looked tired in the eyes. He met them with the intention to see, to not gloss over, to not assume, to not rush past the humanity in front of him. He wasn't trying to become someone anymore. He was trying to remember who he already was beneath the layers of becoming. One night, he sat on the floor of his living room. Lights dimmed, a single candle flickering nearby. He placed his palms on his chest and closed his eyes. The breath moved easily, like it trusted him now, like it had been waiting for him to stop pushing long enough to be felt. And as he sat there, he remembered the voice that had woken him weeks ago, that soft, persistent whisper inside, "Come home." And he smiled because he finally understood. He was home, not because life had become perfect, not because he had figured everything out, but because he had stopped running. He had stopped looking outside for what was always within. He was just trying to stay awake. There was something different about the way the days were unfolding now. He no longer counted them in hours or appointments, but in moments. Moments of presence, moments of stillness, moments when his heart felt soft without explanation. Each day didn't bring new challenges so much as new invitations. Invitations to pause, to witness, to listen. He found that life didn't demand anything from him but awareness, and that changed everything. He woke earlier than usual that morning, even before the light had begun to color the sky. The city was hushed, suspended in that rare breath between night and day. He sat up in bed and felt the texture of the sheets, the coolness of the air against his skin, the beat of his heart echoing quietly within. These were things he had taken for granted all his life, and now they were the very things that made him feel alive. He didn't turn on the lights. He moved through the apartment in near darkness, letting the faint glow of the moonlight guide him. It was enough. He brewed tea slowly, the sound of the water filling the kettle, the click of the stove, the hiss of heat warming water. Each step, each sound held meaning. He had finally stopped treating his life like something to rush through. He was living in it now, as though each breath was the only one that mattered. With his cup in hand, he stepped out onto the balcony. The wind was soft and carried the scent of damp concrete and distant blossoms. The city lights shimmered below like stars that had fallen and made peace with the earth. And as he stood there sipping tea in silence, he felt that same peace within himself, not loud, not obvious, but steady. He thought about how much had changed, not just around him, but within him. There was a time when he couldn't sit still without discomfort, when silence felt like judgment, when rest felt like failure. But now silence felt like a friend. Stillness felt like a gift. Rest felt like a return. And this transformation hadn't come in a flash. It had come slowly, through the quiet practice of showing up, day after day, breath after breath. Later that morning, he took a walk without any destination. He had grown fond of walking aimlessly, not as a means of escape, but as a way of coming closer to himself. He followed whatever street called him, turned corners on instinct, allowed his feet to lead without questioning where they were going. And in that surrender, he found a rhythm, one that echoed his heartbeat, one that reminded him he didn't need to control everything to feel safe. He passed a mural painted on the side of an old building, two hands reaching for each other but never quite touching. He stopped and stared at it for a while. There was something poetic in that space between the fingers, something honest. He thought about all the moments in his life when he had been reaching, hoping, striving, and all the times when he had missed the connection by just a breath. The evening breeze carried with it a strange kind of clarity, the sort that doesn't arrive through thinking, but through feeling. He had been sitting on the rooftop for a while now, watching the lights of the city shimmer like quiet conversations. The sky was a canvas of dark blue, streaked with remnants of sunset and the early rise of stars. There was no noise in him tonight, no urgency, just a stillness that felt earned. He took a slow breath and closed his eyes, allowing the wind to brush over his face like a familiar touch. In this silence, memories drifted in, not the sharp ones that hurt, but the soft ones that linger. saw his childhood self running barefoot through the grass, chasing a paper kite. He saw his younger self writing poetry on scraps of paper he never showed anyone. And he saw his recent self, the one who had finally learned to stop chasing and start listening. All versions of him meeting in this quiet moment, not competing, but coexisting. He opened his eyes and looked up at the sky. For years, he'd stared at stars with longing, as if they held answers he could never reach. But now he saw them differently, not as destinations, not as distant ideals, but as reminders that light could travel through darkness and still arrive, that something could burn far away and still touch you. It wasn't about knowing where the stars came from. It was about allowing them to be enough. He had been meeting life in a different way lately, not through control or planning or perfection, but through presence, through showing up with empty hands and an open heart. It didn't always look beautiful. Some days were messy. Some days he forgot everything he'd learned and slipped back into old rhythms. But even then, he was different, because now he noticed. He saw the slipping. He named it gently. And then he returned. Always he returned. One morning he visited the cemetery. He wasn't there for anyone in particular, just drawn by the silence, the way the trees arched protectively over the stones, the way time felt paused. He wandered among the names etched in stone, wondering about the lives behind them, the stories left untold, the regrets, the laughter, the dreams. And as he stood among them, he whispered, "I won't waste this life." It wasn't a vow made out of pressure or urgency. It was a whisper of gratitude, a recognition that he was still breathing, still able to feel, still able to choose. He knelt by a grave that had no name, only the word beloved etched into the stone. Something about that word pierced him. To be beloved. Not for what you do or what you have or how perfectly you live, but simply for existing, simply for being. He stayed there a while. Let that word echo inside him until it softened something he hadn't realized was still tense. Later that week, he received a letter in the mail. Handwritten from a friend he hadn't spoken to in years. The words were raw, honest, filled with apologies and memories. And reading it, he didn't feel the sting of old wounds reopening. He felt the warmth of old connections resurfacing. They didn't need to be what they were. They could be what they were now. New, quieter, but still true. He wrote back, not to revive the past, but to honor the present. His words weren't polished, they were real. And that, he had come to learn, was what mattered most. There was a small bookstore he now visited almost weekly. It was run by an older couple who always greeted him with soft smiles and gentle voices. The shelves weren't organized, not in any logical way. Books leaned into each other like old friends. And in the back corner, there was a single chair by a window where he often sat for hours, reading or simply watching the world go by. One day he found a book with no title on the spine. Curious, he opened it and discovered it was a journal, left behind, perhaps forgotten, filled with someone else's reflections. The writing was tender, filled with questions, doubts, quiet prayers. He didn't recognize the handwriting, but he recognized the feeling, that longing to understand, to be understood. He placed the book back on the shelf, grateful for the glimpse into another soul. That's how he saw people now, not as puzzles to be solved, but as stories to be honored. Everyone was carrying something. Everyone was writing something inside them that the world couldn't always read. He started practicing something he called invisible kindness. Small acts with no audience. Picking up trash without needing to be thanked. Leaving a flower on a stranger's doorstep. Paying for someone's coffee and walking away before they noticed. It wasn't about being good. It was about being connected. About remembering that we're all part of something larger than ourselves. He noticed how often people just needed someone to see them, not solve them, not advise them, just see them. A nod, a held gaze, a hand on the shoulder. These were the new miracles, the everyday ones, the ones that didn't need to be posted or praised, just offered. He began ending his days with a single question. Where did I meet life today? Some nights the answer was in a conversation. Other nights it was in a silent walk through the park. Sometimes it was in a mistake he had made and forgiven, and every time the answer reminded him that life wasn't waiting to begin. It was already here. He stopped needing milestones. He stopped chasing meaning. Instead, he created it. In the way he said thank you, in the way he touched the world with his eyes, in the way he met his own pain with softness. There was a moment one evening as he stood beneath a street lamp with light rain falling around him. Questions, fragments, but each word felt like a breadcrumb guiding him home. He stopped editing, stopped trying to be profound. He just wrote what was true. One night he wrote, "I am not trying to be light anymore. I am just trying to stop running from the dark." He stared at the sentence for a long time, then closed the notebook and exhaled. That was it, the core of it all. He had spent so many years running, from shame, from pain, from the parts of himself he didn't know how to hold. But now he was turning toward them, not to fix them, but to befriend them. He spoke more gently to himself now. When he made a mistake, he didn't spiral into self-criticism. He simply said, "It's okay. You're learning." When he felt overwhelmed, he didn't push through. He paused, took a walk, breathed into his chest and said, "You're safe." These small acts of kindness added up. They softened him, reminded him that growth doesn't always look like forward movement. Sometimes it looks like resting, like forgiving, like beginning again. He stopped comparing himself to others, stopped measuring his life by timelines or titles. Instead, he started asking, what feels true today? Some days it was calling a friend. Other days it was being alone. Some days it was productivity. Other days it was sitting in the sun doing nothing. And each choice, when made from presence, became a thread in the tapestry of a life that no longer needed to impress anyone. He wasn't trying to be good anymore. He was trying to be real. A lake, not to the sky, but to the boy inside him. I see you now. The sun was rising behind him, casting gold over the trees, pulling shadows back into the earth. And in that light, he saw the path, not a physical one, but something clearer. A knowing, a direction that didn't need a map because it didn't lead somewhere new. It led back to what was always there. He stood, his legs a little unsteady, like someone walking for the first time after being asleep for years. He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't have a plan, but for the first time in a long time, he trusted himself. Not the version of himself that knew all the answers, but the one that finally knew how to ask the right questions. And maybe that's where all healing begins. Not in fixing, not in escaping, but in asking gently, bravely, where did I lose myself? And how can I come home? He turned and began to walk again, this time not away from the pain, but through it, step by step, breath by breath, not chasing peace, but becoming it. The city was just beginning to stir when he returned home. The streets still held the hush of early morning, and the lights from the apartments above blinked softly like distant stars. For the first time, he noticed how the city had a rhythm too. Not just noise and movement, but breath, a rising and falling. A kind of pulse that had always been there, but had been drowned out by the pace he once thought necessary. And as he walked through it now, it no longer felt like a place he had to keep up with. It felt like a place he could meet slowly, deliberately, as if offering it a new version of himself with every step. His apartment door creaked when he opened it. Inside, everything was still. Familiar objects waited for him. Books, framed memories, the chair by the window where he used to sit and scroll through life without really living it. But something in the way he entered made the room feel different. Not because anything had changed in the space, but because something had shifted inside him. It was like returning to a house you had lived in for years and suddenly noticing how beautiful the cracks in the walls are. The imperfections no longer asked to be fixed. They asked to be seen. He sat on the floor instead of the couch, legs crossed, back straight, just breathing. The city continued outside. Cars, voices, the clinking of dishes from a cafe down the block. But inside it was still. Not the kind of stillness that feels empty, but the kind that feels like a beginning. He picked up a notebook from the shelf, one he hadn't touched in months. The pages were only half full, plans, ambitions, half-finished thoughts from a man trying to outrun himself. He didn't tear them out. He turned to a blank page and simply wrote, "I've arrived." There was no ceremony, no epiphany, just those words. And they were enough. The days that followed were different. He didn't jump back into work, didn't announce anything. He just lived, one breath at a time. He walked to the market in the morning, noticing the colors of fruit as if seeing them for the first time. He made tea in silence, watching the steam rise like an old friend. He began speaking more softly, moving more slowly, as if honoring everything he touched. The way he folded his clothes, the way he set his keys down. Each act became a form of presence, a form of prayer. People began to notice. Friends texted, "Are you okay? Where have you been? You seem..."